Hello everyone. Apologies for being gone for so long. I had a bit of family issues come up. But without any further delay, let's get back into the Red Notice. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 5. The Bouncing Check. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life, only it was in a field that barely existed. Although the Iron Curtain had been lifted, nobody was investing any money in Eastern Europe. I knew that would eventually change, but in the meantime, my best option was to simply stay at BCG, assuming they would let me. After returning from the fiasco in Sanic, I kept my head down, praying that Wolfgang hadn't submitted a recommendation to fire me. To my great relief, he was either too distracted or had forgotten because nobody came to my office with a pink slip. I finally knew I was in the clear in late January 1991 when John Lindquist suggested that he and I write an article together. If I were going to be fired, why would one of the top partners in the firm want to write an article with me? That piece he had in mind was about investing in Eastern Europe, which we would submit to a trade magazine called Mergers and Acquisitions Europe. I looked into M&A Europe, and it appeared to have an almost non-existent circulation. But I didn't care. I was ready to exploit any avenue that would help me establish myself as an expert on investing in the region. To write the article, I studied everything I could get my hands on. I read a stack of more than 200 news stories and quickly learned that fewer than 20 deals had ever been done in the former Soviet bloc. The most prolific investor was Robert Maxwell, a maverick 350-pound British billionaire who was originally from Czechoslovakia and had done 3 of the 20 deals. I figured I would impress John if I could get an interview with someone in Maxwell's organization. So I called Maxwell's press office, mentioning the article. They must have not done any homework on M&A Europe because, amazingly, I was offered a meeting with the deputy chairman of Maxwell Communications Corporation, MCC, Jean-Pierre Almisny. The following week I showed up at Maxwell House, a modern building halfway between Mayfair and the neighborhood known as the City of London. I met Almasi, a Suez, English-speaking Frenchman in his late 50s, and he welcomed me in with a plush office. As we made small talk, I arranged my paperwork neatly between us, but just as I started to ask my first question, Almani pointed at one of my spreadsheets and asked, "What's that?" "That's my Eastern European dealer list," I said, happy that I had come so well prepared. "May I have a look at it?" "Of course." I pushed the spreadsheet across the table. He examined it up and tensed up. "Mr. Browder, what kind of journalist makes an M&A deal list?" It never occurred to me that I might be too well prepared for this meeting. "Could you tell me a little more about this magazine you work for?" "Well, I don't know. I don't exactly work for a magazine. I'm actually at the Boston Consultant Group. I'm doing this article freelance because I'm fascinated about investing in Eastern Europe." He leaned back and gave me a thoughtful frown. "Why are you so invested and interested in Eastern Europe?" I then told him the story of how excited I was to be an investor in the very first privatizations in Poland, and about my AutoSam, and my career ambitions of investing in the Eastern Bloc. When it became clear to him that I wasn't there to spy on Maxwell or his company, I really began to relax. You coming here today might actually be very fruitless." He stroked his chin. "We're in the process of setting up an investment fund called the Maxwell Central and Eastern Europe Partnership. You strike me as the type of person we'd like to hire. Would you be interested?" Of course I would. I tried to conceal my eagerness, but I couldn't. And by the time I left, I had a job interview scheduled in my calendar. To prepare for it, I spent the next 2 weeks tracking down anyone who knew what it was like to work for Robert Maxwell. He owned the Daily Mirror in London, a local tabloid, and regarded as not merely eccentric but impervious, testy, and impossible to deal with. So I had my concerns. I found an ex-BCG consultant named Silva Greeny, who had once worked for him. I got her on the phone and asked for her advice. After a long silence, she said, "Listen, Bill, forgive me if I'm being blunt, but in my opinion, you'd be totally out of your mind going to work for Maxwell." "Why is that?" "Robert Maxwell is a monster. He fires everybody all the time." Silva said with feeling, made me wonder if she had been one of those people he'd fired. "That's not very comforting." She paused again. "No, it isn't." There's lots of stories I could tell you, but there's a dramatic one that's been making the rounds. About 6 months ago, Maxwell was on his private jet in Tampa, Florida. The plane was taxiing toward the runway, and he asked his assistant for a pen to sign some documents. When she handed him a bureau ballpoint instead of his usual malt block, he became furious. He demanded to know how she could be so stupid not to have the right pen. She didn't have a good answer, and he fired her on the spot. She was literally deposited right onto the tarmac. This poor 26-year-old secretary from Essex had to find her way back to London all on her own. I found out 3 more ex-Maxwell employees and got 3 equally outrageous and colorful anecdotes, all with one common denominator. Everybody was getting fired. One banker, a friend at Goldman Sachs, said to me, "The probability of you lasting a year there is 0, Bill." I considered these stories carefully as the interview drew nearer, but they never succeeded in scaring me off. So what if I got fired? I had a Stanford MBA and a BCG on my resume. Surely I could find another job if I needed to. I did the interview, then 2 more. Within days of the last one, I was offered the position. Against all warnings, I accepted it. I started my new job in March 1991. With my higher salary, I moved into my own place, a nice little cottage in Hampstead, northwest London. From there, I walked down a narrow road and got on the northern line to Chancery Lane, where I made my way to Maxwell House. Robert Maxwell had purchased this building in part because it was one of only 2 in London that allowed helicopters to land on the roof. This enabled Maxwell to commute from his home at Headington Hill Hall in Oxford to his office by helicopter, avoiding traffic. The idea of the boss arriving in such style sounded impressive until I experienced it for the first time. With windows open on a warm spring day, I heard a static whirl of a helicopter approaching. As we got closer, the sound became more intense. By the time it was directly overhead, papers in the office started to fly everywhere. All telephone conversations had to stop because of the noise. Things returned normally when the helicopter had safely landed and the rotors were switched off. The whole ordeal lasted 4 minutes. On my first day of work, I was told I could pick up a copy of my employee contract from Maxwell's secretary. I headed up to the 10th floor and waited in the reception area for a secretary to get around to dealing with me. As I flipped through the annual report, Maxwell himself burst out of his office. His face was red, and his underarms of his shirt were soaked through with dark circles of sweat. "Why have you not yet got me Sir John Morgan on the telephone?" he yelled at his assistant, an unflappable blonde woman in a dark skirt who had neither surprised nor offended by the outburst. "You didn't tell me you wanted to speak to him, sir," she said calmly over the top of her glasses. Maxwell barked, "Look, missus, I haven't got time to tell you everything. If you do not learn to take the initiative, you and I are going to fall out." I slunk into my chair and tried not to be noticed, and as quickly as Maxwell appeared, he lumbered back into his office. The assistant finished what she was doing and handed me an envelope with a knowing look. I grabbed it and made my way back to the 8th floor. Later that day, I mentioned the incident to one of the secretaries near my desk. "That's nothing," she huffed. "A few weeks ago he shouted so loudly at someone from his Hungarian newspaper, the poor man had a heart attack." I went back to my desk, my contract suddenly heavy in my hands. That evening, as if to confirm what everyone really thought of Maxwell, as soon as the whomp-whomp of his helicopter could be heard, indicating that he was leaving, loud cheers rolled across the office floor. I could not but wonder, have I made a big mistake by coming here? On the Monday of my 2nd week, I arrived in the office and found a new addition, a fair-haired Englishman, a few years older than me, sitting at the spare desk. He stood and offered his hand. "Hello, I'm George Ireland. I'm going to be sharing this office with you." His English accent was so upper crust and pronounced that at first I thought he was faking it. George wore a dark 3-piece suit and a copy of the Daily Telegraph on his desk. A tightly furled black umbrella leaned against his filing cabinet. He struck me as the character of the perfect Englishman. I found out later that George had previously worked as Maxwell's private secretary, but unlike the others in that position, he had quit before he was fired. As he was a close childhood friend and an Oxford roommate of Maxwell's son, Kelvin, another place was found for George. Where the humiliations Maxwell inflicted on his death, he had a strange and well-developed sense of family loyalty, which he had extended to George. But as soon as I met George, I was suspicious. Was he going to report everything back to the boss? Everything I said. After introduction, George and I settled at our desks, and a few minutes later he asked, "Bill, have you seen Eugene anywhere?" Eugene Katz was one of Maxwell's financial bag carriers who sat nearby. "No," I said offhandedly. "I heard that Maxwell had sent him to do some due diligence on a company in the U.S. George sneered incredulously. "Due diligence on a company? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Eugene knows nothing about companies. You might as well send your local publication to do this due diligence," he said, inflecting the last two words for effect. Over the course of our first day together, George proceeded to destroy the possibility of my feeling deferral towards anyone in the organization. He had such a keen eye for absurdity and hypocrisy and such a razor-sharp wit, that I had a hard time not laughing any time one of Maxwell's top lieutenants was mentioned in conversation. That is how I learned that George was not spying on me. From George's running commentary, it became obvious that Maxwell managed his company more like a corner shop than a major multinational corporation. Everything about it reeked of nepotism, dysfunction, and bad decision-making. Yet, I felt I had landed the best job in the world. I achieved my goal of becoming an investor in Eastern Europe. Maxwell was the only person making investments in the region. If anyone in Eastern Europe wanted to raise capital, they would have to come to us, since I was the one who vetted all the deals. I was effectively the gatekeeper for every Western financial transaction in that part of the world, all at the tender age of 27. By the fall of 1991, I'd reviewed more than 300 deals. I traveled to nearly every country of the former Soviet bloc and was responsible for making 3 significant investments for our fund. I was exactly where I wanted to be. But then, after returning from lunch on November 5th, I switched on my computer and was greeted with a red Recruiter's headline. "Maxwell missing at sea." I chuckled and swiveled in my chair. "Hey, George, how'd you do that?" George was always organizing pranks, and I figured this was one of them. Without looking up his desk from his work, he said, "What on earth are you talking about, Bill? This thing on my reader screen. It's really convincing." "What's on your reader screen?" He rolled his chair to my desk, and we stared at it together. He said slowly, "That's when I realized that it wasn't a joke at all. Our small office had glass interior walls, and I could see Eugene, white as a ghost, running towards the elevator. Then a few senior executives rushed past, struck with the similar looks of panic. Robert Maxwell was indeed missing at sea. This was horrible news. Maxwell may have been a bastard, but he was also an undisputed patriarch of the organization. And now, for better or worse, he was gone. Nobody in the office knew anything about what happened, so George and I stayed glued to our readers. This was before the internet, and readers were all we had for breaking news. 6 hours after the first headline appeared, we learned that Maxwell's enormous body had been lifted out of the Atlantic Ocean off the Canary Islands by a Spanish naval search and rescue helicopter. He was 68 years old. To this day, nobody knows whether it was an accident, suicide, or murder. The day after Maxwell died, the share price of MCC plummeted. This was to be expected, but it was made worse because Maxwell used shares of his company as collateral to borrow money to support the share price of MCC. These loans were now being called in by the banks, and nobody knew what could be repaid and what couldn't. The most visible effect of this uncertainty was the endless procession of well-dressed, nervous bankers who lined up to meet with Eugene, desperate to get his loans paid. While we were all shocked by Maxwell's death, we couldn't help worrying about our own futures. Would our jobs be safe? Would we get our year-end bonuses? Would the company even survive? A little more than a week after Maxwell's death, my boss called me into his office and said, "Bill, we're going to pay bonuses a little early this year. You've done a fine job and we're going to give you £50,000. I was stunned. That was more money than I had seen in my entire life, and twice what I was expecting. "Wow! Thank you." Then he handed me a check. Not a machine-typed check issued by a payroll department, but a handwritten one. It is very important that you go down to the bank and ask for express clearing of this to your account straight away. As soon as you're done, I'd like you to come back here and let me know how it went. I left the office and walked quickly to Barclays on High Holborn and nervously presented the check to the teller, requesting that he be cleared to my account immediately. "Please take a seat, sir," the teller said before disappearing. I turned and sat in the old brown sofa, tapped my feet nervously, reading a savings account brochure. 5 minutes passed, I picked up another leaflet on mutual funds, but couldn't focus. I started thinking about the Thai vacation I was going to book for the Christmas holidays when this was all over. 30 minutes passed. Something wasn't right. Why was it taking so long? Finally, after an hour, the teller returned with a bald, middle-aged man in a brown suit. "Mr. Browder, I'm the manager." He shuffled slightly and looked at his toes before eyeing me warily. I'm sorry, but there aren't sufficient funds in the account to clear this check. I couldn't believe it. How could MCC, a multi-billion-pound company, not have enough money to cover a £50,000 check? I grabbed the uncashed check and quickly made my way back to the office to tell the boss the news. His bonus was going to be orders from factories larger than mine, and to say that he was unhappy is putting it mildly. I went home that evening crestfallen. In spite of the dramatic developments at work, it was my turn to host a weekly expat poker game. My nerves were so frayed that I could easily have done without it. But by the time the day was over, 6 of my friends were already on their way to my cottage. In the age before cell phones, it would have been impossible to track each of them down to cancel. I went home and one of my friends showed up, mostly bankers and consultants, plus a new guy, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. When they were all there, we opened some beers and started to play dealer's choice. After a few rounds, my friend Dan, an Australian at Merthyr Liège, already down £500, which was a big loss in our game. Some of us thought he would give up and go home, but he put on a brave face. "No worries, mates," he said cockingly. "I'm going to make a comeback. Besides, bonus time is coming up, so who cares about lifting £500? The combination of a few beers, the boastful talk, and Dan's impeding payday made it impossible for me to keep my mouth shut. I looked around and said, "Guys, you won't believe what happened to me today." I started to tell the story, but before continuing, I said, "You guys have to promise to keep this to yourselves." Heads nodded around the table. I went through the day's drama. My banking friends were transfixed. Bonus was the only thing that investment bankers cared about, and the idea of getting a check and not being able to cash it, is an investment banker's worst nightmare. The game finished shortly after midnight. Dan never made his money back, and everyone went home. Even though I had finished the game 250 quid down, I was satisfied knowing that I told the best story of the night. I went to work the next day as if everything was fine. But when I got to the office, there was a strange group of men assembling in the reception area. They were so out of place that I pointed them out to George. He rolled his chair over to my desk and we watched them together. Unlike the parade of dark-suited bankers from before, these men wore ill-fitting blazers and raincoats and looked completely uncomfortable. They headed briefly before fanning out across our floor. A young man, not more than 25 years old, walked into our room. "Morning, gents," he said with a thick Cockney accent. "You probably don't know why you're here. My name is P.C. Square Jones. And this," he waved his arm in a general gesture, "is now crime scene." P.C. Jones took our details, and, as George and I watched, started placing white evidence tape over our desks, computer screens, and briefcases. He then asked us to leave. "When can we come back?" I asked nervously. "I'm afraid I don't know that, sir. All I know is you have to go. Now." "Can I take my briefcase?" "No, that's part of the investigation." George and I looked at each other, grabbed our coats, and quickly left the building. As soon as we got outside, we were met by a swarm of reporters at the building's entrance. "We part of the fraud," one shouted, tossing his microphone in my face. "Where's the Panacea's money?" another demanded, camera rolled over his shoulder. "What'd you do for Maxwell?" as everyone yelled. I couldn't think as we pushed our way free of the reporters. Several of them trailed us half a block before giving up. We didn't know what to do, so we walked briskly towards Lincoln's Inn Fields and ducked in the Sir John Soane's Museum. As soon as we were safe, George started to laugh. He thought the whole thing was a big joke. I, on the other hand, were in shock. How could I have been so stupid not to listen to everyone's advice about Maxwell? When I got home that afternoon, I turned on the news, and the lead story in the channel was the $460 million hole that had been discovered in the MCC's pension fund. Maxwell had looted the firm's pension fund in an attempt to prop up the company's sagging share price. And now 32,000 pensioners had lost their life savings on this pension. On the BBC, I saw the melee at the entrance of our building and even caught a glimpse of myself fighting through the crowd. Later that night, the BBC reported that Maxwell was the biggest fraud in British history. As I was trying to calm down, my phone rang. It was Wall Street Journal reporter who had been in my poker game. He was working on a story about Maxwell fraud and was keen to include the incident I told him on poker night about the bounced check. I was very skittish. My colleagues would be furious if they knew I'd blabbing to reporters, but he persevered and reassured me that his story wouldn't identify me. I grudgingly agreed, but felt mortified as soon as I had to hang up. On the morning of Monday, I left my peaceful cottage and walked to the Hampstead tube stop. I picked up the Wall Street Journal, and there was his article. Towards the end, after referring to Maxwell as the bouncing check, he wrote, "A senior Maxwell employee says his paycheck didn't clear when he tried to bank it this week. Then on Friday, he arrived at his office to find fraud investigation investigators clearing out his files." I got on the tube and reread the piece. He didn't use my name, but I was pretty sure that everyone I worked with knows me. I felt like I made a monumental fuck up. Why couldn't I have just kept my mouth shut? When I got home, I fought my way through the scrum of reporters on my way to the 8th floor. As I crossed the office, I stared straight ahead, avoiding the eyes of my coworkers, and went right to my desk. George arrived a few minutes later, completely oblivious to my indiscretion. But as soon as I was bracing myself to tell George about my stupidity, a new group of strangers showed up in reception. This time, they were the bankruptcy administrators. One walked over to our office, popped his head in, and said, "Go to the auditorium. There's about to be an important announcement." George and I followed his instructions and found 2 empty seats together. About half an hour later, a middle-aged man carrying a clipboard appeared. His sleeves were rolled up, he had no tie, and his hair was mussed, as if he had nervously been running his fingers through it over and over. He took the podium and started reading from his prepared statement. "Good morning, everyone. I am David Sullivan from Arthur Anston. Last night, Maxwell Communications Corporation and all of its subsidiaries were put into administration. The court had appointed Arthur Anston as bankruptcy administrators to wind up the company. Following standard procedures, our first course of action is to renounce redundancies." He began to read names, in alphabetical order, of all the people who were being fired. Here and there, secretaries started weeping. One man stood and shouted obscenities. This man tried to get close to the stage, was stopped by a pair of security guards and escorted away. Then George's name was called, along that of Robert Maxwell's son, Kevin, and just about everyone else I knew at the company. Amazingly, my name wasn't called. Of all things, I had been warned before taking the job. The one thing that was sure to happen, my being fired, didn't happen. I soon learned that administrators had kept me because they had no idea what to do with the investments in Eastern Europe. They needed someone around to help sort them out. I grabbed onto this little victory, thinking it would make it easier for me to find a job when everything was over. Unfortunately, I could not have been more wrong. I was no golden boy anymore. Having Maxwell on my resume was as toxic as it could get. I soon discovered that nobody in London would touch me. That is chapter 5. So, now, let's read through chapter 6. The Mersink Trawler Fleet. Nobody, except for one firm, Solomon Brothers. In 1991, just as Maxwell generated a huge scandal in Britain, Solomon Brothers had done the same in the United States. In the previous autumn, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, caught some top Solomon traders trying to manipulate the U.S. Treasury bond market. It was unclear how hard the SEC would pursue its case, and even whether Solomon would survive. It was a similar thing happened a year before at another firm, Drexel Berman Lambert, and it went bankrupt, leaving many people unemployed. Fearing a similar fate at Solomon, many of the good employees had jumped ship and found new work elsewhere. This left gaping holes at Solomon that needed to be filled, and I was desperate for a job. In better times, Solomon might have shunned me. They were desperate as I was. And after an intense round of interviews, they offered me a position as associate in the East European investment banking team in London. It wasn't exactly what I wanted. My dream was to be an investor, the person deciding what I wanted. The person deciding what shares to buy, not an investment banker, the guys who organize and sell shares. Moreover, the title wasn't as good as my title as Maxwell, and it came with a significant pay cut. But beggars can't be choosers. So I gratefully took the offer. I was determined to put my head down and do whatever was necessary to get my career back on track. Unfortunately, Solomon was probably one of the most unnatural places to do that. If you've ever read Liar's Poker, then you know that Solomon Brothers was one of the most dog-eat-dog firms on Wall Street. To say that I was nervous on my first day would be a gross understatement. I arrived at Solomon's office above Victoria Station on Buckingham Palace Road in June 1992. It was unusually warm and sunny, and I walked through the large set of wrought iron gates and took the long escalator up 3 flights to the main reception area. I was met by a well-dressed vice president a few years older than me. He was curt and impatient and seemed annoyed at having been tasked with greeting me. We walked across the auditorium and through some glass doors to the investment bank. He showed me to my desk and pointed to the box of business cards. "Listen, things are pretty simple around here. You generate 5 times your salary in the next 12 months and things will be fine. Otherwise, you're sacked. Clear?" I nodded and he left. That was it. No training program, no mentors, no orientation. Just do it or get fired. I tried to settle into my chair in the bullpen, the open area where all junior employees sat, unsure of what to do next. As I leafed through the Solomon Brothers Employee Handbook, I noticed a secretary sitting nearby, speaking loudly into the phone about flights to Hungary. When she put down the receiver, I walked over. Sorry to eavesdrop, but I'm a new associate and can help hearing you talk about Hungary. Do you know what the firm's doing over there? Oh, that's okay, she said, reassuring. We all listen to each other's conversations. I was making reservations for my live previtation team to go to Budapest next week. Who's working on that? You can see for yourself. She pointed towards a group of men sitting in one of the glass windowed conference rooms just off the bullpen. While I had been there only a few hours, I knew that if I was going to succeed, I needed to take some initiative. I thanked the secretary and marched over to the conference room. As I opened the door, the 6 people of the Maliv team stopped talking, turned to me, and stared. Hi, I'm Bill Browder, I said, trying to mask my awkwardness. I'm new on the Eastern European team. I was hoping you guys could use some help on your deal. The uncomfortable silence was broken by the 2 younger team members who giggled under their breath. The team leader then politely said, Thanks for stopping by, Bill, but I'm afraid we're fully staffed. That was a little embarrassing, but I didn't let it affect me. I kept my eyes open and asked around and found another opportunity several days later. The Polish telecom privatization team was having a meeting to discuss the next phase of their project. I knew that they might get a bigger fee than the Malev team, so I figured they might not be so resistant on another person around. When I showed up to the meeting, the man in charge was much less polite than the Malev team leader. Who told you you could come here? He demanded. We don't need you on this or any other deal we're doing in Poland. Nobody wanted to share their revenue with me because they were all struggling with the same 5 times formula that I was. Everybody was simply fighting to protect their turf in Eastern Europe. For several weeks, I ransacked my brain trying to figure out how I was going to survive in Solomon. But then I noticed something interesting. Nobody was doing anything in Russia, meaning there was no one to fight me over it. I decided to take the chance. I decided to take a chance. I declared myself the investment banker in charge of Russia, held my breath, and waited to see if anyone would object. Nobody did. From that moment on, Russia was my territory. But there was a good reason why no one cared about Russia. There was no paid investment banking working to do there. While Russia may have been politically free, it was still Soviet in every aspect, including their use of investment bankers. I stubbornly ignored this fact and set out to find whatever business I could. I tirelessly went to conferences, meetings, luncheons, and networking events all around London, hoping some business would fall into my lap. 3 months in, I still hadn't made a single penny for Solomon, and my prospects were not looking good. Then a lawyer who had met at a networking event told me about an advisory assignment for the Murmansk Trawler Fleet, a Russian fishing operation 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The fleet had been put on a tender for President Advisor. I didn't know the first thing about fishing, but I learned how to make an excellent proposal at BCG, and I set to work. I searched Solomon's deal database, looked for anything to do with trawlers or fishing, and remarkably, 15 years earlier, the Tokyo office had been invested and all included in several transactions including Japanese fishing companies. 15 years seemed like a long time, and these were debt deals, not privatizations. But what the hell? I stuck all the Japanese experience into the proposal, tidied it up, and sent it to Murmansk. A few weeks later, the phone rang. A woman named Irene Deb was calling on behalf of Murmansk Trawler Food President. Mr. Brown, she said with a thick Russian accent, we would like to inform you we have accepted your proposal. I briefly wondered if they had even received any others. When could you come to Murmansk to begin the assignment? She asked awkwardly. It sounded like it was the first time she had spoken to a Western investment banker. I was elated. I had bought into the first piece of real business, but the tender didn't say how much they would pay. Since I hadn't made any progress towards the goal of making 5 times my salary, I was hoping for something significant. In a deliberate and formal voice that I thought would make me sound older and more credible, I said, I'm very honored you've chosen our firm. Can I inquire how much you intend to pay for the assignment? Irana spoke in Russian with someone in the background, then said, Mr. Brown, we have the budget of $50,000 for 2 months for this assignment. This is acceptable for you? My heart sank. It's hard to describe how small $50,000 is to an investment banker. Linda Evanstadt, a supermodel from the 1980s and 1990s, once famously declared, I don't get out of bed For anything less than $10,000 a day. For an investment banker, that number is more like $1 million. But here I was, earned nothing for Solomon, and 50,000 was much more than zero. So I agreed. A week later, I set off for Mersik. The first leg of the trip was a 9:30 a.m. British Airways flight to St. Petersburg. It took 4.5 hours, and 3-hour time difference. I arrived in the late afternoon at St. Petersburg's Plovdiv airport. I stared out the window as the plane taxied to the terminal and was astonished to see the burned-out carcass of an Air Flight passenger plane lying on the side of the runway. I had no idea how it had gotten there. Apparently, it was too much of a bother for the airport authorities to have it moved. Welcome to Russia. Since the Air France scheduled lots of its regional flights in the middle of the night, I had to sit in the airport for another 10 hours until 3:30 a.m. to make my connection to Mersnik. Waiting all that time would have been painful in any airport, but it was particularly so at Plovdiv. There was no air conditioning, and even though it was so far north, the air was hot and stuffy. Everyone was smoking and sweating. I tried to get away from the bodies and cigarettes, but even after I found a row of empty seats, a large stranger plopped down next to me. He didn't say a word, but he pushed my arm off the armrest between our seats and promptly lit a cigarette, taking pains to blow the smoke in my direction. I got up and moved. I finally boarded the old Aeroflot Tupolev 134 just before 3:30 a.m. Its seats were threadbare and sunken. The cabin smelled of tobacco and old age. I slid into a window seat, but it wouldn't lock into position, and every time I leaned back, it would fall into the person's lap behind me. So I didn't lean back. The cabin door closed, and we moved out to the runway without the slightest hint of a safety announcement. We took off and were treated to a short but excitingly bumpy flight. When the plane neared Mersik, the pilot announced something in Russian. Another passenger who spoke English explained that we'd been diverted to a military airport an hour and a half drive from Mersik because of a problem at a municipal airport. I was relieved when the plane finally came to land, but my relief was short-lived. The runway was so potholed and crooked, and the landing was so violent that I thought the wheels were going to get torn off the plane. When I finally disembarked at 5:30 a.m., I was completely exhausted because I was so far north. Apologies. The late summer sun was low in the sky and had barely set. There was no terminal at the military airport, just a small warehouse-like building and a parking lot. But I was happy to see that the trawler's fleet president, Yuri Podkov, had made the trip to greet me. Ivana, not smiling and leggy blonde with too much makeup, was there too. Putev was almost a carbon copy of the general manager of Autosan, late 50s, large, with a handshake like a vice. He and I sat in the back of the company car, while Ivana sat in the passenger seat, twisting around the translate. The driver took off across the desolate tundra landscape that looked like a moon. 90 minutes later, we arrived in Moonsnik. I was dropped off at the Moonsnik Best Hotel, the Arctic. I checked in and went to my room. The bathroom smelled like urine. There was no toilet seat, and large chunks of porcelain were missing from the sink. The room's window screen was broken, allowing mosquitoes the size of golf balls to fly in and out freely. There was no curtains to blot out the barely setting sun, and the mattress was lumpy and sunken in the middle, as if it had been changed in 25 years. I didn't even unpack. My only thought was, how soon can I get the hell out of here? A few hours later, Putev returned and drove me to the docks for the tour of the fleet. We walked up the rusting gangplank to one of the trawlers. It was a huge ocean-going factory that stretched hundreds of feet long, boasted a crew of more than 100 men, and was capable of holding thousands of tons of fish and ice. As we descended into one of the subdecks, I was hit by the overpowering odor of rancid, spoiled fish that hung in the air. I felt like throwing up the entire time Putev spoke. Remarkably, he was unfazed by the smell. I pitied the poor guys who worked on the ship for 6 months at a stretch without any reprieve. We toured the vessel for 20 minutes, then made our way to the fleet offices at 12 Transylvania Street. These were just depress it and tumble down as the boats, but thankfully it didn't smell. The lighting in the hall was weak and green, and the walls of the reception area looked like they had been painted in decades. I couldn't help but think that everything about this operation was an insult to these senses. But then, as we settled down to a cup of lukewarm tea, we started to discuss the financial situation of the company, and my perceptions started to shift. Tell me, Mr. Pinto, how much does one of these boats cost? I asked, Irina still translating. We get them for $20 million new at the shipyard in East Germany, he asked. How many do you have? How many do you have? About 100. How old are they? 7 years on average. I did the math. $100 at 20 million each meant that they had 2 billion worth of ships. I figured that the fleet was 7 years old and that it was half the precedent means that they had 1 billion worth of ships at current market price. I was amazed. These people had hired me to advise them on whether they should exercise the right under the Russian President program to purchase 51% of the fleet for $2.5 million. $2.5 million for a stake in over $1 billion worth of ships. Of course they should. It was a no-brainer. I couldn't understand why they needed anyone to tell them this. More than anything I wished, I could have joined them in buying the 51%. As I went over with this workshop, I felt the release of that familiar chemical in my stomach, the one I'd felt after my 10-bagger in Poland. I wonder, is this still unique to Merchant Trawler Fleet, or is it the same thing that happened all over Russia? And if it is, how can I get involved? I was scheduled to return to London the following day, but I was so excited and agitated that I bought a one-way ticket to Moscow instead. I had found that if the shares of every other Russian company was just as cheap as this one, nobody would miss me in London anyway. They barely knew I existed. After arriving in Moscow and collecting my bags, I went to an airport kiosk and bought a small English language business phone directory. I'd never been to Moscow, didn't speak a word of Russian, and hardly knew a soul. I got in an airport taxi and told the driver I wanted to go to the Metropole Hotel on Red Square. He must have known that I was easy pickings because I learned they charged me 4 times the normal rate. We sat in snow traffic on Leningradsky Provyat, a boulevard that was wider than a football field, slowly passing hundreds of identical Soviet-era apartment buildings and billboards advertising strange-sounding companies. The cab pulled up to the motor pool 2 hours later, across the Bolshoi Theater. When I got to my room, I called a friend in London who had worked in Moscow, and he gave me the numbers of a driver and a translator, each of whom cost $50 a day. The next morning, I went to the phone directory and started cold calling anyone who seemed relevant to see if they were willing to discuss the Russian privilege program with me. I ended up seeing official from the U.S. Embassy, some people at Ernst & Young, a junior Russian official at the Prison Ministry, and a Stanford alum who had worked at the American Express, among others. Over 4 days, I arranged a total of 30 meetings, and from there I pieced them together a full story of what was going on with the Russian privatization program. I found the transition from communism to capitalism, the Russian government had decided to give away most of the state's property to the people. The government was going about this in a number of ways, but the most interesting was something called voucher privatization. And as part of the program, the government granted one president's certificate to every Russian citizen, roughly 150 million people total, and taken together this is exchangeable for 30% of all Russian companies. 150 million vouchers multiplied by $20, the market price of the vouchers equaled $3 billion. Since these vouchers were exchangeable for roughly 30% of the shares of all Russian companies, this meant that the valuation of the entire Russian economy was only $10 billion. That was 1/6 the value of Walmart. To put that in perspective, Russia had 24% of the world's natural gas, 9% of the world's oil, and produced 6.6% of the world's steel, among other things. Yet this incredible trove of resources was trading for merely $10 billion. Even more astonishing was that there was no restriction on who could purchase these vouchers. I could buy them. Solomon could buy them. Anyone could buy them. If what had happened in Poland was profitable, then this would be off the charts. I returned to London a man possessed. I wanted to tell everyone in Solomon they were giving money away free in Russia. I started going to one of the guys at the Eastern European Investment Banking desk with my discovery. But instead of congratulating me, he frowned and asked, "Where are the advisory fees on this? How can you not understand that this could easily go up 100 times? Advisory fees? Was he serious? Who gave a shit about advisory fees?" I went to someone in the investment management division expecting him to hug me since I was sharing the most jaw-dropping investment opportunity he would ever see in his life. Instead, he looked at me as if I was suggesting that the firm invest in Mars. After that, I went to one of the traders of the emerging markets desk. He looked at me quizzingly and asked, "Where's the spreads and trading volumes of these vouchers? Who cares whether they're 1% or 10%? I'm talking about making 10,000%. Nobody at Solomon could divorce themselves from their own narrow mindset. Perhaps if it had been more suitable and clever, I could have found a way to pierce their myopia. But I wasn't. I had no political skills, and for weeks I kept presenting my idea over and over, hoping that the reputation would eventually get through to someone. Instead, I'd ruined my reputation inside Solomon Brothers. No one wanted to do anything because I was that crazy fuck who wouldn't shut up about Russia. The other associates I used to hang over stopped inviting me for lunch and after-work drinks. It was now October 1993, and I'd been Solomon Brothers for just over a year. I was an object of ridicule through Solomon, and worst of all, I had made the firm only about $50,000 in total, meaning I should be fired at any moment. As I despaired over my impending dismissal, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the New York extension, 2723. I answered. The man on the other end had a deep southern drawl, like a Georgia lawman. "Hey there. This Bill Browder?" "Yes. Who's calling?" "Name's Bobby Ludwig. I heard you got something going on in Russia." I never heard this guy before. I wondered who he was. "Yeah, I do. Do you work for the firm?" "Yep, in New York. I was wondering if you might be able to do me a favor and come tell me what you're up about." Sure. Can I check my schedule and get back to you?" "Of course." We hung up. I immediately called someone I knew on the emerging markets desk who had worked in New York and asked him about this Ludwig person. "Bobby Ludwig?" he asked, as if I was stupid not to know who he was. "He is one of the top producers at the firm. Weird guy, though. Some people think he's crazy, but he makes money year after year, so he kind of does whatever he wants. Why do you want to know?" "No reason. Thanks." Bob was the exact person I needed to get me out of my rut. I phoned him back immediately. "Hi, this is Bill again. I would love to come to New York and give you a presentation on Russia. Friday work for you?" "Sure, I'll be there. See you then." I stayed up 2 nights in a row putting together a PowerPoint presentation on Russian equities. That Thursday, I took a 6 p.m. British Airways flight to New York. Skipping the onboard movies and reviewing the presentation over and over, I couldn't blow this opportunity. I rented Solomon Brothers HQ at 7 World Trade Center at Friday morning. The Twin Towers glistened in the bright morning sun just southeast. I was set up to the 36th floor and met Bobby's secretary. She greeted me and swiped us through the door to the trading floor. It was huge. Desks went as far as the eye could see, and the energy was palpable. This was raw, aggressive capitalism to the core. We walked along the side of the floor, passing a dozen rows of desks, and through a short hallway that led to Bobby's office. Bobby's secretary announced me, and left. Bobby was behind his desk, staring out the window towards New York Harbor. He was about 50, but looked much older, with his unkempt red hair and a stringy mustache that fell over his corners of his mouth. Except for a bunch of messy stacks of reports, his office was Spartan, and aside from the desk and chair, the only furniture was a small, round table and 2 other seats. As Bobby asked me to sit, I noticed that he wore a pair of beat-up leather slippers, and this red tie was stained. I learned that this was his lucky tie, which he had worn nearly every day since he had made $50 million on a single trade. Bobby settled behind the desk and I got out my presentation, put a copy in front of him, and started to talk. Normally, when one gives presentations, audiences indicate that they're interested or bored or curious. But Bobby didn't do any of that. He just stared vacantly at the charts and graphs as I flipped through them. There was no ahas or nods or anything else that gave me an indication I was getting through. Just a blank stare. It was unsettling. Then, when I was about halfway through the slides, Bobby abruptly stood up, without a word, stepped out of the office. I didn't know what to think. This was my final chance to save my career at Solomon, and I was blowing it. What could I have done wrong? How could I salvage this meeting? Should I speed up the presentation? Slow it down? What the hell should I do? For nearly 40 minutes, I stood in panic and uncertainty. But then I saw Bobby returning. He stopped to say something to his secretary and then slowly came back in. I stood, ready to beg if that's what he was going to take. But before I could get a word out, Bobby said, "Browder, that story is the most amazing I've ever heard. I just went down to the risk committee and got $25 million for us to invest in Russia. Don't waste time doing anything else. You get back to Moscow and let's put this money to work before we mess out. You hear?" Yes, I did. I heard loud and clear. Well, that is chapter 5 and chapter 6. I am definitely getting more interested in this book the more it goes on. But if you guys are also interested, let me know. Because I don't want to just keep reading and you guys be in a sense of annoyance that I'm not reading what you want me to read. So, if you ever want me to read something new, just let me know. But I hope you all have a great day. See you in the next video. And if you are willing, support me on my Ko-Fi so that I can start making live streams of me playing games and reading. I'll see you all in the next one. I hope you all have a great day.